Welcome to the first lecture in our unit on content regulation. There's going to be 2 video lectures in this unit as well as 2 PowerPoints. And we're looking at mostly government regulation of content, whether it be broadcast content, cable, satellite, and sometimes internet content. And when we talk about censorship or government regulation of content, we always come back, of course, to the First Amendment, freedom of speech. So let's just take a quick look at the freedom of speech. The First Amendment, of course, we're all pretty familiar with the text. But let's take a close look and note some things. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. I'm kind of skipping a little bit here, and we're going to skip over the right of people to peaceably assemble, So the First Amendment provides protection from state action. Note, we said that Congress shall make no law respecting, etc. So there's protection from state action, not so much from private parties. So for instance, broadcast or cable companies still have the right to exercise editorial control. So when you hear things bleeped on TV or even sometimes cable, bleeping expletives is a form of editorial control and not necessarily government censorship, and therefore does not technically violate the First Amendment, because the First Amendment looks at government regulation of content. Again, looking at the First Amendment, the Supreme Court had the notion that the ruling that there is no such thing as a false idea. It's the purpose of the First Amendment to preserve an uninhibited marketplace of ideas in which truth will ultimately prevail, rather than to countenance monopolization of the market. Therefore, the First Amendment sort of encourages disagreement. Now, there are instances in which there can be repercussions for abuses of the freedom of speech, or where the government can actually intervene. So, for instance, in the cases where speech can be limited, there must be a clear and present danger. For example, you cannot deliberately incite a riot, nor can you shout fire in a crowded theater without there being some kind of legal repercussions. Again, remember, when it comes to the First Amendment, we're talking about how it protects us from government censorship, but broadcast management can exercise editorial control over their own reporters and performers as a private decision. The intent also of the First Amendment was to avoid what is known as prior restraint, or preventing in advance something from being said, published, or broadcast, which was one of the main sins or evils that the authors of the Constitution were trying to avoid. So only in extreme cases will a court issue an injunction barring a TV program from broadcasting a story that may be construed as an invasion of privacy, which is implied in the, I believe, Fourth Amendment, the right to privacy. Now, some people have expressed concern over the trend of religious leaders using the airwaves to get parishioners to support a specific political party or candidate, noting that this could be construed as a withering of the line between establishment of religion by the government. Now, the FCC holds religious licensees to the same standards as any other broadcaster, but has sort of resisted any kind of close monitoring to this point. So in the you can see a little bit of a conflict between 2 of the freedoms contained therein. Now, in broadcasting and print, there are sort of different levels of freedoms, if you will. TV and radio have fewer First Amendment rights than newspapers and magazines. Now, broadcasting, because it has unique attributes that justify imposing certain limitations, that's why they have essentially fewer rights when it comes to to them versus newspapers and magazines. For instance, channel scarcity is one reason why the government can sort of restrict First Amendment rights when it comes to broadcast. Not everyone who wants to own a broadcast station can do so because there's limited availability. Also, broadcasting is intrusive. Radio and television can enter directly into virtually any U.S. household. It's readily available to people of all ages and types, and because of its intrusiveness, it's easily accessible to children. Therefore, Congress and the courts and the FCC have often imposed content regulation on broadcasters that would not be allowed. Regulations wouldn't be showing up in print media. And then, of course, conflict in licensing. Under the Communications Act of 1934, the FCC is required to grant or renew licenses only if they serve the public interest. When it comes to the First Amendment and other electronic media, cable sort of falls between print and broadcasting. The government must determine how new electronic media should be treated in terms of free speech and free press guarantees. And the Supreme Court has held that cable television does have First Amendment protection, but that protection must be balanced against what it is called competing social interests. Subscribers make a conscious decision to receive cable, whereas broadcast is transmitted everywhere. So cable isn't quite as intrusive as broadcasting because people have to subscribe in order to receive it. On the other hand, we have what is known as the must-carry rule, and that is sort of a limitation on the speech of cable systems if you look at it from their point of view. Meanwhile, when it comes to the internet, there's very few limitations so far on the internet. Now, we will be looking a little bit at net neutrality later in the course. The internet is pretty difficult to control, to regulate for the government. The user must act affirmatively and deliberately to retrieve information online, so it's less intrusive than broadcasting or even cable. Now, when we talk about libel, that is defamation by published or broadcast, words that expose someone to public hatred or shame. And invading someone's privacy can violate their right to solitude, protection, and right from intrusion, which is implied in the Fourth Amendment. Now, when it comes to libel, you must prove, if you bring a libel suit against someone, you must prove that they had actual malice in harming you. And the landmark case for that standard was the Times versus Sullivan in 1964, which the Supreme Court ruled that public officials and public figures have less protection than normal citizens against libel. And that is the end of our first lecture on content regulation. Remember, we're going to have one more, and we're going to look into some other topics regarding content regulation.